Production of tall timbers into the light is made possible in part by a grant from the Barnett Bank of Tallahassee. Additional funding has been provided by the Balfour Lumber Company, harvesting today for the forests of tomorrow, and by the Williams Family Foundation.
This is Tallahassee, capital city of one of the fastest growing states in the Union, Florida. Every day, more than 900 new residents arrive in Florida, continuing a phenomenal expansion that has seen the population rise from 2.8 million in 1950 to well over 11 million today. Ironically, the desirable natural conditions in the southern states that have attracted so many new people are themselves being threatened because of the rapid growth. What are the immediate effects of this kind of growth on the delicately balanced environment? More importantly, what effect will this strain on the environment mean to future generations? And how can we learn to correct these problems? The poet Wordsworth gave us direction a long time ago when he said, "Come forth into the light of things, and let nature be your teacher."
I'm standing 15 miles north of Tallahassee on what was once a large private plantation. Its owners loved the beauty of the surrounding pine forest and the hunting. And the people who are here now are also hunters. But their prey is much more elusive than the bob-white quail that once was sought. These people are looking for answers.
Larry Landers is the current director of Tall Timbers Research Station.
The greatest challenge in conservation today is that more wildlands are disappearing because human populations continue to expand. Tall Timbers is set up to conduct long-term ecological research so we can learn how to do a better job of land management on a dwindling wildland base.
To fully understand the changes now going on in this environment, it's important to know the history of man in the area. Dr. William Bruckheimer is a professor of geography at Florida State University and has done extensive research into the lives of the earliest inhabitants.
At the time the Spanish came in, about 1539, this country must have had a very dense Indian population, far denser than I think most people realize. One of the persons that traveled with De Soto said that he traveled along a broad road, and on either side of the road he could see cornfields, squash fields, and so on, for the length of 2 leagues, which would be 6 miles in either direction. And he talked about villages of up to 250 houses, and within a crow's call of each other. In other words, you could hear a crow call from the next village. At the end of the Civil War, cotton prices were depressed. Farming was not a very rewarding occupation, financially speaking. And you had a situation all over this part of the country where there were a lot of large acreages owned by people who weren't doing too well. And that was kind of the setting at the time that these people began to come down from the north to Thomasville.
When rich northerners offered those farmers much more money for their land than they could make raising crops, thousands and thousands of acres changed hands. Logging companies were also interested in these pine forests, but the northern sportsmen offered top dollar. If they hadn't, the beauty of this area, not to mention its value as a habitat for wildlife, might have been destroyed.
In the late 1800s, the country began to hear rumors about the benefits of breathing the pine-scented air in Thomasville, Georgia. Wealthy northerners arrived here in their private, lavish railroad cars. Well, they may not have all found better health, but one thing they did find was lovely, lush pine forests filled with wildflowers and quail.
Edward Beadel was one of them. Richard Wilhelmy is leading the work of restoring the Beadel House to its original condition. He has read through Mr. Beadel's papers, seeking clues to the man that will help guide the renovation.
The Beadel House here on Tall Timbers was originally constructed by Mr. Edward Beadel, an uncle to to Henry Beadel. When Henry obtained the property in 1919, he decided to try to live here. While he was here at Tall Timbers, he became very much interested in ecology and in nature. This is Mr. Beadel's workbench. He didn't like going outside and doing work in the garage or anything else, so he put his workbench right here in the family room or in his lounge. And this workbench is where he made his gun stocks for his cameras, so that he could mount the particular camera he wanted to use and then be able to shoot his ducks and quail and various wildlife here on the plantation. It was in this room also that he asked all of his friends to come, and he would, as soon as he made a shot and had them developed, he had his movie projector set in here, and it's large enough to bring his guests in, and they would then study these nature films. The more I work on the house, and the more I examine Mr. Beadel's property that he left, and the more that I read his diary, the more I admire the man. He was not only a hunter, but a naturalist. Nowadays, you're either a hunter or a naturalist, but he was both. Even though he hunted daily here on the plantation for ducks and quail and doves, he was very much interested in nature and preserving that nature.
In the early part of the 20th century, wildfires swept over the western United States. The newly formed U.S. Forest Service ordered a nationwide policy of total fire exclusion, no burning at all. Within a couple of years, Henry Beadel and other plantation owners noticed reduced numbers of quail. They asked the U.S. Biological Survey team to conduct a study of the problem. The young ornithologist sent by the government to conduct the 5-year field study was Herbert Stoddard. In 1923, Stoddard came to this 1,000-acre plantation, the Hall, to live and work. Stoddard soon learned that fire suppression had caused the drastic decline in quail. Stoddard was given the Hall as a token of the plantation owners' gratitude for the return of large numbers of quail. Stoddard then continued to educate landowners on basic wildlife management. Ed Kamarick came to work as an assistant to Stoddard in 1934.
I think if anybody deserves the title of the father of game management, it's Herb Stoddard, because he took these plantations down here and demonstrated from a practical standpoint that the wildlife of a property, including game animals, were a product of the land, and if the land was managed right, you got a crop. If you didn't manage right, you didn't get a crop. And one reason Stoddard realized the value of fire, because as a boy he grew up in what is Orlando, Florida now, and rode around with the cattlemen. He realized the cattlemen were burning, and they were burning for a purpose, and they knew what they were doing.
Betty Kamarick was an educator and naturalist even before her marriage to Ed. Later, she and her husband hosted what became regular Sunday meetings of those who were passionate about the study of nature, including Henry Beadel.
And I remember Mr. Beadel, he was always very quiet and would listen to all this argument, not come into it. He'd be sitting there puffing his pipe one day, and he said, well, he said, I just got to thinking. He said, I don't have any relations to give my place to. I said, what do you think if I turn it over to y'all for a research station? Oh, we all just stood there, you know, gaping. Well, that's just exactly what we wanted.
One of the first projects of the station was the study of a series of 1-acre plots that would be burned at varying intervals of between 1 and 100 years. Fire ecology continues to be a focal point of Tall Timbers research. Stoddard's theories on the use of controlled fire as a tool for improving wildlife habitats are constantly being refined.
Basically, our objectives are to try to increase the longleaf pine production on this area. The entire forest has been burned about a year ago now, and you can see the vegetation is just 1 year old, but it's very thick already. You can see hardwood brush starting to come out of the grasses and the other herbaceous species. So it's time to burn again for that. Well, see, there's almost an art to prescribed burning. You have to use test fires to determine whether or not conditions are right for you to get the job done that you want.
Over a period of time, the longleaf pine forest has adapted to periodic natural fires. Controlled burning must be introduced if that environment is to be maintained. But working with fire is never easy.
So we're going to use the backfire that we started to create a burn strip, a black burned area, and that'll secure the whole forest for the fire. He's backed off of the actual fire break that we created, and he's setting another fire line just to make sure that we get enough burned area here to be as a safe barrier when the head fire does come. You can see that the pine trees are doing well in it. The fire's moving through and taking out a lot of the underbrush, the stuff that we don't want in here. It's also taken out a lot of, you can see, shortleaf pine and loblolly pine that has come in here. This is one thing we're trying to do away with. It's in competition with longleaf pine. So it takes a pretty hot fire to get the job done that we're trying to do here. There's a good contrast here. You can see how this fire here is reacting. It's a backfire. The flames are only about 6 inches tall, just creeping along, just a few feet per hour, really, in contrast to the fire that you just saw, which has become a head fire. You can see the fire's done real well right here. It accomplished our objectives, and that was to start gaining control of the hardwoods and the pines that we didn't want in here. We were trying to favor the longleaf pine and bare the ground so we'd have a seed catchment. So when this fire cools down and it's all over, it'll be perfect for the seeds, which are going to be falling in the next few weeks.
There's always change, and disturbances are an essential part of nature. Neither the longleaf pine forest nor its wildlife inhabitants would be here were it not for recurring fires. The quail research that originally brought Stoddard to tall timbers has progressed far beyond the horizons of the research station.
Brad, when you all put transmitters on folks like Bob here, you developed your own. Tall Timbers made its own tiny little transmitter. Why didn't you use ones that were already commercially available?
Well, the ones that are commercially available they're good transmitters, but they're made for a variety of animals and therefore are a compromise for any one given animal. And we felt that since we would be doing a lot of quail work with telemetry, that it was best to develop our own, and one that had a few more of the attributes that we thought were needed in a quail transmitter. The old-style quail transmitters sit on the animals' backs, and therefore they might have been more susceptible to hawks and owls that prey upon them. Our transmitter sits on the chest and has some features that allow us to know when the animal is alive or dead or nesting. And it goes on quite easily. It slips over the head of the bird and is worn as a medallion down on the chest of the bird, an area in which the bird is accustomed to carrying weight because they store seeds in what's known as their crop. Old Bob has had some rough times over the past 20 or 30 years. There's been a tremendous amount of social changes in the use of the land that have really adversely affected his populations. And what we're really trying to do is look at ways to modify the land through some low-cost management techniques to increase their populations.
One project of enormous potential importance to land management is still in the early stages of development.
And one of the high costs of quail management is many people annually plant corn patches, and these corn patches provide many benefits to the quail. They provide a nutritious seed, high concentration of bugs for the chicks to feed on during the first couple weeks of life. They provide cover, and they also act as a way to diversify or to break up the habitat type and produce plants that are good native game bird food plants. What we're working with is a plant that is a cross between corn and the plant that is thought to be the ancestor of corn, a grass indigenous to Mexico known as teosini. Now, the beauty of teosinte is that it's a perennial species and that it'll grow for many years. And so our goal was to cross teosinte with corn in hopes of developing a perennial, growing many season, nutritious seed plant that will provide good cover and also produce large amounts of insects for the young. But hopefully through selection and maintenance of individual pedigrees on the plants, we can create this summer perennial that will go a long way towards easing some of the economic burdens of land management.
Jimmy Atkinson has applied many land management techniques to this 2.5-mile nature trail, which serves as a living laboratory to show the benefits of careful maintenance.
The area we're walking through right here is an annually burned area, and it grows very quickly. And if you don't burn it every year, then it grows into shrubs and then up into trees. And as that grows, you lose the animals or the birds or mammals that are using this. They leave with the growth of the plant. So it's an active management that has to be done every year.
So the nature trail is to teach people, but how do they know what they're seeing when they come out here?
Well, Beverly, we have a written guide that goes along with the trail. The trail itself is 2,000 meters long. At every 50-meter intersection, we have one of these metal markers with a number on it. The number then corresponds back to the guide. It'll tell an individual what the management practice we've applied to that parcel of the trail is. It'll tell the person the general plants, dominant plants in that area, the birds or mammals that they might expect to encounter along that section. We also have about 60 plants, either trees, shrubs, or annuals that are identified both by common and scientific name. So if someone's interested in learning the plants of this area, they can walk this trail with this guide and learn by themselves.
This is the Wade Tract. Not only is this the oldest longleaf pine forest left in the South, it is the largest mapped forest in the world, meaning scientists know the precise location of almost every tree.
This is the last of the forest that's left. This is probably the largest single preserved tract left in existence. And from this, we're trying to learn how the forest works, and in particular, the role of fire and other types of environmental factors that affect the forest, so that we can understand how to manage and even restore this type of forest in different areas of the southeastern United States. Post-Civil War period, loggers built railroads into the entire area and clear-cut almost 30 to 60 million acres of longleaf pine forest, the kind of forest we have here. We have long-term studies going in which all of these trees are marked and tagged, and we follow them and study them, so we know the history of each and every individual tree that's out here. These are seed traps. The seeds are produced in these cones, and they fall out, and we have in some of these been able to trap seeds like this. This is a mast year. This is a year when their trees are producing lots of cones. There may be as many as 10,000 seeds on some of these trees right now. Within just a couple of weeks, they'll be released, and they'll sort of come drifting down out of the pine cones onto the ground, where they'll germinate to form new pine trees. This is a study of the genetics of the pines. From this seed, for example, we'll be able to analyze the tissue and determine who the parents of this seed are.
In addition to being valuable for their beauty, wildflowers and grasses play a critical role in this fire-dependent ecosystem.
The ground cover, Beverly, is incredibly important in maintaining a fire regime in this kind of habitat. This time of year, we see a variety of beautiful composites, goldenrods, blazing stars, plus a whole range of grasses out here. There are 200 to 300 species of different kinds of plants that grow on the ground in this type of forest. And these species are all, to one degree or another, pyrogenic. They all will burn, many of them even with green vegetation on them. They provide the fuel, in addition to the pine needles, for the fire that then moves along on the ground, especially in these open areas in between the clumps of pine trees.
The long-term effects of hurricanes on these natural systems are being studied. In low, damp areas where fire rarely enters, forests are comprised of mixed hardwoods rather than pines. That's the case here in the Woodyard Hammock on Tall Timbers ground.
About 2 years ago, in November 1985, a very different kind of disturbance occurred. The eye of Hurricane Kate passed very close to Woodyard Hammock, creating a very different kind of disturbance. Trees came down, large numbers of trees came down, creating very large openings in the forest floor. This created a very different kind of light environment, one in which many different species were able to respond, one of very increased light levels, one in which species that prior to this time had shown no response to openings in the overstory now began to respond. So a totally different type of environment was created. This type of disturbance had last occurred about a half-century before. We know from the records of the ages of trees that hurricanes occur, on the average, every 20 to 50 years within this type of forest. Thus, there are species that have become adapted for utilizing this kind of opening within the forest.
Tall Timbers is committed to sharing the lessons derived from its research. The Nature Conservancy is already applying those lessons on its extensive international land holdings.
At present, we have protected through acquisition, through purchase, close to 3 million acres. And that has created the largest private system of nature preserves in the world. Within the past year, we've been developing this collaborative fire management program through Tall Timbers Research Station, using their expertise, using their name, and taking some of their research results and applying it to management of our preserves.
In the morning light, Lake Ammonia's tranquil beauty is undeniable. But this lake is dying. It's so pretty out here this morning. It's hard to realize that Lake Ammonia has struggled, has gone through some hard times, a lot of changes, and that it is in fact a dying lake now. So why is it? How'd that happen?
Well, it is a troubled lake. Basically, there's been interference of the natural ecology of the lake. And you have to go back a little bit into the history of it to understand, really. But prior to about 1940, the lake would periodically go dry. We have records that show that it was completely dry in 1910, 1917, and for the last time in about 1934. Now, it's a very shallow lake. It's only about 5 feet deep on the average. And it has sinkholes in it, like a lot of the lakes in North Florida and South Georgia do. And there's a main sinkhole in this lake, and it's right over here. When a drought period would occur, the lake would pretty much drain out primarily through this one sink. During those times, it was so dry that people would even farm out here. They would run their cows out here, and on some occasions, fire would come off the mainland and burn all the way across it and even burn up some of the islands out here. So it was, when that would happen, all these weeds that you see here, all these lily pad plants, they would disappear for a time. Then it would start raining again. The sink could no longer control that water, and the sink would partially close up. It would fill with water, and it was a new lake. It was a rejuvenation process. Then in 1940, they built the spillway, and effectively a dam between the main body of the lake, which is nearly 6,000 acres at average water. And as a matter of fact, when they were building the dam, Mr. Beadel, the man who actually founded Tall Timbers, raised a big fuss about it. I mean, he tried to stop it. Mr. Beadel used to actually go out and burn part of the marsh during the periods when the water was down and was dry enough to burn, and that would stimulate vegetation that ducks would feed on, the kind of seed-producing plants. And he knew a lot about the lake because he spent a great deal of time out here and photographing birds and whatnot.
Floridians have not given up on Lake Ammonia. Efforts to fix the lake are being undertaken by both government and private organizations.
The wood duck is an unusual bird, strikingly beautiful and unusual in the sense that a portion of the population breeds in the south, hence the local name summer duck. And since we do have a breeding waterfowl in this area, it's an opportunity for us to try to do some management on them. Woody's had some hard times in past years, long liberal seasons, heavy hunting, and destruction of bottomland hardwoods, primarily for agricultural purposes, just about decimated the population. However, they've come back and they have high productivity. They produce a lot of ducklings, and they've responded quite well to reductions of shooting and also the production of these wood duck boxes, of which they nest in many times.
The immense challenge of wildlife management lies in the great diversity of the Southeast. Over 5,500 plants, 450 resident animals, plus many migratory species. We need to know which animals and plants respond together. Tall Timbers gets its leads from testing the application of management tools experimentally.
We're learning about what has happened, and we're trying to have input on what should happen. You have to have data. You have to, especially today, you have to have concrete information that you can convince people with now. You can't do it with emotion. You can't do it with just plain logic, because people have logic that's counter to what your views might be.
It is clear that the best management practices do not come from sudden breakthroughs. Rather, they come from gradually learning about very complex systems. The work begun by Stoddard, Beadel, and Comeric a half-century ago has laid a solid foundation in acquiring that necessary wisdom. And in that long view lies Tall Timber's unique strength. This Center for Long-Term Research will continue to share technology to benefit wildlife and ultimately man's life. The things they are learning here will help guide conservation into the future and into the light.
Production of Tall Timbers into the light is made possible in part by a grant from the Barnett Bank of Tallahassee. Additional funding has been provided by the Balfour Lumber Company, harvesting today for the forests of tomorrow, and by the Williams Family Foundation.